Hello, and thanks for attending this webinar. So let's just wait a minute for everyone to join. And while we are waiting, if you can let me know where are you joining from, this would be great. I'm calling in from Zagreb, from Croatia. And, just send me a message through a chat window, which country, which city you are from, and so that, I can see where all the attendees come from. And while we are waiting for your feedback, just a couple of notes. So first of all, we are recording this webinar, and you'll be able to watch it basically from the same page where you registered for this webinar. And second thing, you'll be able to download this presentation deck, and I'll explain you how to download it at the end of this webinar. So if you stick until the end of the webinar, I'll explain you where to find this PDF presentation deck. All right, I think we can start. Welcome to this webinar, how to set the ISMS scope according to ISO 27001. My name is 𝗨𝗏𝗿𝗁, and I'm the main ISO 27001 NIS2 and 𝗂𝗲𝗴𝗏𝗁 expert at 𝗹𝗲𝗿𝗂𝗏. 𝗹𝗲𝗿𝗂𝗏 is a company that makes compliance easy to understand and simple to use. And this webinar today is streamed through Zoom, also through LinkedIn Live events and YouTube Live. And it will last approximately 45 to 60 minutes, depending on the number of questions you'll have. And I'll try to make the webinar as interactive as possible, so that you can ask as many questions as you want. And the more the questions, actually, the more interesting the webinar will be. So feel free to ask as many questions as you want. And you can actually ask your questions during my presentation. You do not have to wait for this Q&A session at the end. So by all means, ask questions, and I'll try to answer the questions even as I go through the presentation. Good. Now let's, I see someone attending from Greece. Great. Thanks for letting me know. Good. Now let me move on to the next slide. So why is this topic important? Because if you set this ISMS scope, I would say in a wrong way, if you set the scope too big or too small, then actually it could take your whole project or a good part of your project in a wrong direction. So it's really important that very early in the project you set this scope correctly, so that you don't have any problems afterwards. And of course, I'll show you during the webinar how to do it. So the topic of the webinar is how to set the scope that is basically appropriate not only for your company but also for the certification audit. And the webinar is intended for both consultants and for implementers who are dealing with who are implementing with ISO 27001. Good. So let me first emphasize one important thing about ISMS scope that is sometimes misunderstood, and this is that when you define actually the ISMS scope, this does not mean which controls you are going to apply or which controls you are not going to apply. This is something else. This is really about defining which information, which data you want to protect. Okay, so basically defining the which controls you're going to use to protect your data. This comes later on in the project, and there is actually one slide where I'll show you these steps and in which step you define the scope, and in which step you define how to protect your data. But what is important to understand is that defining the scope is not about defining which controls you want to implement. It's rather defining what is your, let's say, most sensitive data or information that you want to protect. And by the way, also see also someone joining from Rome. So I assume this is Italy. So thanks also for letting me know. Good. Yeah, let me now move on to the next slide. So let's see briefly the agenda. First I'll go very briefly on how to document the scope. There are basically two documents that you have to be aware of when defining the scope. Also, these dependencies and interfaces, so how to define and what they actually are, and how they are relevant for the scope. And then I'll show you this process of defining the scope, so basically the steps. I'll also explain this dilemma, how to define the scope if your servers are in the cloud, so if you're using cloud services. Also how to handle security when you actually process your data with third parties, right? When your data is actually outside directly of your direct control. And of course, at the end, we'll go through this Q&A session. And by the way, let me know through chat which of these topics you'd like me to focus on. Yeah, simply send me a message, and I'll then try to kind of spend most of the time or more time at these topics that you're interested in the most. So let me know which of these are most interesting for you. Good. Now let me move on to this question of where you actually document, where you define the scope. So the first document that you have to write is this ISMS scope document. And basically this is your internal document. You can write it on 1 or 2 pages, where you define the elements of your scope. And I'll show you the elements in the next slide. So, but basically this document is a little bit, I would say, more detailed than the next one. And the next one actually, where you define the scope, is this ISO 27000 certificate. So this is not your internal document. This is a document that is produced by the certification body. And of course, if you go for the certification, right? If your company goes for a certification, then you'll get this certificate. And on the certificate, it needs to say what is your ISMS scope. Now here, the ISMS scope is described maybe in a half a sentence, right? So this scope here is a very shortened version of your scope document that you defined first. So in any case, your internal scope document should be longer. The certificate itself, which is written by the certification body, they summarize the scope there in a very, I would say, a short sentence or a half a sentence. Good. Now let me, and by the way, we'll share now with you a link to an article which is called "How to Get ISO 27000 Certified." So it's an article which explains, you know, this various aspects of certification, including this certificate. And if you join the webinar through Zoom or through YouTube, then you'll be able to link this. You click actually this link and open the web page with this article. If you joined through LinkedIn, then because of some limitations in the LinkedIn, you can't really click these links that we are sharing with you. But the workaround for this is that you simply copy the URL and paste it in your browser, and you'll be able to open the link. Okay, now how should you actually document the scope in your internal ISMS scope document? So what is acceptable is that you will define the processes, the departments, locations, exclusions for this scope. So you basically say, okay, we included in the scope only our departments for, let's say, research and development. Let's say that you are a pharmaceutical company and you want to focus your scope only on research and development department. So you define this in terms of departments. You define this also in terms of processes. So you say, okay, we have, I don't know, 4 processes within our R&D department, and these are the processes that are included in the scope. You define the location. So you have, I don't know, 1 address or a couple of addresses, and then you specify them. And then you can say, okay, here are the exclusions. So then, you know, you can say that you're excluding, I don't know, temporary students that are there. You're excluding any, I don't know, consultants that you might have temporary on the site. So these kind of things. So by doing these 4 things, by describing these 4 things, you actually describe your scope in a very precise manner. Now, what is not acceptable when defining the scope is that you say that your scope is a product. And this is sometimes the mistakes I see, let's say, with, for example, software as a service companies. They say, okay, here is our product. Let's say here is our new software as a service. We want this to be a scope. And it's not acceptable. This is something that certification auditors are not going to accept. And the way around it is basically that you define which departments are supporting this SaaS product. So you can say that you have, I don't know, customer support departments, that you have software development departments, that you have, I don't know, engineering departments, and that all of these departments that are supporting this particular product are in the scope. And this is the way to go. This is something that will be acceptable by the auditor. Also, what you cannot do is define your scope in terms of technology. So you can't say, here is our server, and basically this is our scope. So it's not going to work. Again, the auditor is not going to accept it. Again, you have to go back and define the scope in terms of all the things that I mentioned before. And also, what is not acceptable is that you define in the scope your controls that you want to implement. So it's not something that is done here. This is definitely something that is done later on, and I'll show you at what time and in which document you actually define the controls, but definitely not in the ISMS scope document. Okay, so let's see this process. When is this scope defined, at which point in time during your implementation? So I'm not starting here with the first implementation step in when you start implementing the standards. And by the way, we shared with you now this ISO 27001 implementation guide. So if you want to see all the steps in your implementation, then you will see. Then take a look at this article that we'll send you now. But basically, one of the first steps that you have to do during this implementation is this understanding the requirements of interested parties. So basically, this is where you collect all the, let's say, legal requirements from your, let's say, laws and regulations, but you're also collecting requirements from your customers, from your partners, because when signing agreements with these customers and partners, they probably have some clauses, security clauses, which they impose on you, and then you actually have to take them into account when defining the scope. So what can happen is, for example, that, I don't know, your main client defines that you need to, implement this kind of specific, let's say, specific types of, let's say, I don't know, security controls specifically within a particular department in your company. In this case, it might make sense actually to include these very departments in your ISMS scope, because otherwise you wouldn't be covering them with your ISO 27001 project. Okay, there is we'll send you now also the link to this article, how to identify ISMS requirements of interested parties in ISO 27001, so you can take a look at and learn a little bit more about this process of identification of requirements. And then the next step is really to define this ISMS scope. This is where you have to define, whether your scope, what kind of department, processes, locations will be covered. And then only after that, you actually define the top-level information security policy. Why does this come after your scope definition? Because in your top-level information security policy, you should be defining your top-level objectives. And you can't really define objectives until you understand which part of your company are going to cover. Because if you're covering your whole company within the ISMS scope, which is perfectly fine, then the objectives will be different when opposed to, let's say, when you define the scope only for, let's say, R&D department or only for IT department, right? So the objectives will be different. Therefore, the top-level policy should be written after your ISMS scope is defined. Then after that, you're doing the risk assessment and treatment. And finally, of course, this is not the last step in the implementation. I'm just showing you the correlation between the scope and defining the controls. In the step when you actually, after you perform risk assessment and treatment, then you have to write this statement of applicability. And a statement of applicability is basically a document where you list all of the controls from the Annex A, and then you define which of these controls you want to implement and which controls you're not going to implement. So what is the main point here? The main point is that you cannot define which controls you will implement before you perform the risk assessment. So you can do this only after the risk assessment. So as you can see, this is what 3 steps further from the defining the scope. So scope is defined right after the requirements, whereas controls are defined much further in the project after you finish the risk assessment and treatment. Okay, we'll send you now 2 more links. So one is to this article which defines, which explains in detail how to do the risk assessment treatment. So this is one article, and the second one is the article about a statement of applicability. So basically, you know, what does this mean and why is it important, how to write it, and so on. All right. Now, another, let's say, tip here is that you should not complicate too much when writing this scope document. And you know, I've seen lots of companies making, you know, mistakes when writing this document, and you know, then they try to kind of explain in very detailed, you know, all the internal and external issues. You know, that they try to write, elaborate on all the external and internal issues in this ISMS scope document. Now, let me make this clear. The standard, I mean ISO 27001, does tell you that you have to take into account the internal and external issues when writing the scope, but it does not tell you to document these things. Okay, so there is no requirement in the standard that you have to write down all the internal and external issues. There is no such requirement, and you know, my recommendation is that, especially if you're a smaller company, don't waste time on writing these things down. You have to take them into account, which is fine. So you basically have to, okay, external issues are especially these requirements from interested parties. Internal issues are simply, you know, the size of your company, the, you know, departments that you have, these kind of things. But again, you don't have to write them down. Second thing that you have to take into account, but you do not have to write them down, are dependencies and interfaces. And this is also something that I'll explain in further slides, what these dependency interfaces are. So you have to understand them, but you do not need to document them. And finally, what I see as a mistake very often that companies are making is that they list all the assets in the scope document. Again, this is wrong, and this is not necessary. You'll have your inventory of assets later on. You will be this will be one of the things that you'll have to document, but again, not in the phase when you're developing your scope. Okay, I see a question from Simon. The question is, isn't the gap analysis the first thing we need to do to set the scope? The answer is no. First of all, gap analysis is not required by the standard, so it doesn't, you know, mention gap or analysis anywhere in the text of the standard. Second thing is, gap analysis is typically recommended for, let's say, mid-size or larger companies, so that they can understand the, let's say, the amount of work that needs to be done as part of this implementation. But gap analysis itself, again, is not needed, and so in most cases, smaller companies are not going to do this gap analysis. Now, typically, you would do the gap, if you want to do the gap analysis, you would actually do it prior to starting your project. So typically, gap analysis, if being done, is done as a, let's say, separate mini project before you actually start the main project. Again, only because mid-size or larger companies would like to kind of estimate the total effort during the main project. But in any case, if you do the gap analysis, is not going to kind of help you define the scope itself. It will only help you, let's say, analyze which controls are implemented and which are not. Because typically gap analysis is done to see which controls are implemented or not. And as I mentioned, you know, the definition of which controls you want or not is not related directly to the definition of scope itself. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, defining the scope is not about defining the controls. Defining the scope is about defining which information or data you want to protect. And by the way, we'll send you now a link to this gap analysis tool, ISO 27001 gap analysis tool. So if you want, you can use this tool to analyze, to do the gap analysis for your company. And by the way, it's a free tool. Okay, good. Now let me go to the next slide, and this is about dependencies and interfaces. And by the way, I also forgot to tell you, you can use this on Advisor website. You can use this big guide to ISO 27001 clauses and NXA controls. So if you want to kind of dig deeper into what the requirements of the standard are, then you can open this article which explains, you know, all the clauses and all the NXA controls. So we'll share now with this link with you, and let me just switch the screen and show you how this looks like. So basically, this is this article, and then you scroll down, you will see, you know, all the clauses from the standard, but also all controls. Then, for example, let's say that I'm interested in this clause 4.3, determining the scope. I simply click on it, and then you have the, you know, explanation of the clause. You have which documents you need to use, what are the implementation steps, what kind of audit evidences the auditor will be looking for. So you can use this tool, I mean this article on our website, and see for yourself, you know, the requirements not only for the scope but for anything within the standard. Okay, now what I wanted to show you is that I published this poll like 2 weeks ago, and basically asked what do you think are the biggest challenges with setting the ISMS scope, and actually two things came up. Dependencies and interfaces, right? So this is one challenge, and the second one is whether to cover the whole company or not. Now switching back to my presentation, I'll cover in this slide, I cover this dependencies and interfaces, and in the next slide I'll speak a little bit about the company size and whether to cover your whole company in the scope or not. Okay, so if I can describe, you know, the scope graphically for some, you know, hypothetical company, let's say that this company A has some three core processes, right? Core process 1, core process 2, core process 3. And it has some support processes, and then let's say that you define that you want all of this to be included in your company. So let's say, I don't know, let's say that this is a SaaS company. Core process 1 would be, you know, software development, customer support, I don't know, engineering department. So these would be the three core processes, and then the support process would be, I don't know, sales, human resources, you know, things like this. And this is basically the scope. And then you define some external services that you're using. So let's say that you're using software development and maintenance, legal services, cleaning services, accounting services. So these are external services. Now, what are the dependencies and interfaces? So let's analyze this accounting services, right? If, I mean, you are incorporated as a company, then you need to do some accounting. If you're not big enough, you're using an external service, which is, I would say, 90% of the cases for smaller companies. And in this case, your basically financial and tax reporting depends on these accounting services. So basically, you're dependent on this external service. And this is what dependencies mean. What do you depend on to operate your normal business? So you're dependent on accounting services, you're depending on cleaning services, legal, and so on. So these are the dependencies. Once you know these dependencies, then you have to understand what are the interfaces. And basically interfaces is anything that stands between you and this entity that you are dependent on, right? So what is the interface between your company and accounting service? Well, basically there are a couple of interfaces. Legal interface would be the agreement that you've signed with this particular company. From the IT point of view, if these let's say this accounting service might actually access your let's say bookkeeping or financial software. So in this case, the interface would actually be this user interface through which this I don't know, your manager or I don't know, your accountant from the accounting service is accessing your own software. Okay, so these would be the interfaces. Okay, now for legal services, they're probably not accessing any kind of software of yours. They might be simply sending you emails with, I don't know, attached documents. So in this case, the interface is simply email, right? So as simple as that. It doesn't have to, you know, this analysis of dependencies and interfaces as, you know, nothing complicated. It basically comes down to these examples that I've shown you. What is my point here? My point is here that you have to understand these dependencies in the first place, and then second, what are the interfaces, in order for you to realize if you can actually exclude someone or something from the scope. In a setting like this, it's pretty easy to actually exclude accounting services, cleaning services, legal services, software development. As a, you know, external software development, it's easy actually to exclude them from the scope because the interfaces are clear, right? Whereas if let's say you have a situation where you want to include in the ISMS scope only one department in your company, then you have other departments in your company where of course you depend, there are dependencies, but the interfaces are not as clear as in this case that I'm showing on the screen now. And this is the catch, right? If these if these interfaces are not clear enough, then you can't really separate this, let's say, other department in a separate and define that they are outside of the scope. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have, let's say, two departments in your company, but that both of these, the employees of both of these departments are sitting within the same room. They share the same local network. They share the same applications, you know, the same accesses, everything is, you know, basically shared. In this case, it's extremely hard to separate and say that only one department is within the scope and this second department is outside of the scope. Why? Because the interfaces between these two departments are, you know, basically almost non-existing, right? On the other hand, if you, let's say, had two departments in the company where one department is sitting on one location, the other department is sitting in another location, where they have completely separate local networks, where they have separate applications, in this case, it's obvious that you can actually exclude one department from the scope and include only another. So you have to keep these things in mind when thinking about these. You have to keep these dependencies and interfaces in mind when defining the scope. Okay, we'll share now with you this link about setting the ISMS scope, and in this article about setting the scope, you'll also see this further explanation about dependencies and interfaces. Okay, moving forward, let's see what is this process of defining the scope, and how is this really related to the company size. So this is basically the first step. So typically what we advise our clients is that if your company is smaller than 50 employees, then it's easier, it's quicker to actually include your whole company in the scope. Now, why is this? This is because for a smaller company, let's say 20 or 30 or 40 employees, it's much harder, much more expensive. It would take much more time actually to figure out how to exclude these other departments outside of the scope for such a small company. And again, it's easier, it's simpler, it's faster, it's cheaper to simply include everything in the scope for such a small company. Of course, if you're a company of a couple of thousand employees, in this case, you will have to go for, let's say, only one department in your company, not for your whole company, because, you know, implementing ISO 27001 in a company of a couple of thousand employees, at this, you know, from the very start, it would be simply too big project effort. So it's better to start small, start again for a larger company, start only with one department. Once you learn how this is done, then you can actually expand the scope step by step. Okay, so the first step is to define to decide whether you include your whole company or not based on the company size. You go for the other steps only if you actually decided that you will include only a part of your company in the scope. So the next step would be to define where the most sensitive information is. So let's say that you are a pharmaceutical company. You can say, look, okay, our more sensitive information data is actually in our R&D department. And this is why we decided that we want to include only the R&D department within the scope. Then you have to figure out what are these requirements of interested parties, because they might also influence the scope. Then you define these dependencies or identify these dependencies, and then you figure out if these interfaces are clear enough. So this is basically, these are basically the steps that you have to do to figure out what will be and what will not be included in your scope. Okay, now there is also this question of how do you define the scope if your data is in the cloud, right? If it is hosted on servers which are not physically yours. And this definition basically defines on what kind of technical solution you're using. You might have your own physical servers in a third-party data center, okay? You might have virtual servers in a third-party computing infrastructure. So this could be, let's say that you're hosting your virtual server, let's say on Amazon AWS, or I don't know, on Microsoft Azure or something. You might be using a third-party platform, or you simply might be using a software as a service. Software as a service is, let's say, Gmail, these kind of applications. And depending on this different technical setup, you will define the scope in a different way. And the key thing here is to figure out what you can and what you cannot control. Okay, so in case of your own physical servers on a third-party infrastructure, you can actually control the hardware, because this is your physical server. You also control the software on this server, and you control the data. In this case, you're including hardware and software and data in your ISMS scope. When we go for this, let's say, when we go for this second example, virtual service in the third-party computing infrastructure, so basically Amazon AWS. In this case, you're not controlling the hardware. Obviously, this is controlled by Amazon, but what you are controlling is the virtual server, meaning the software, and you're controlling also the data, right? Now let's go for this last example. Let's say Gmail. In this case, you're not controlling the software. This is done by Google. You're not controlling the hardware. This is done by Google. You're not controlling the software. Obviously, this is also done by Google. What you are controlling only is the data, meaning the emails that you're receiving and sending. So again, defining the scope when you're using cloud depends really on what kind of solution you're using. You have to keep this in mind. Good. Now let's move on to how you handle security, how you protect data within the scope and outside of the scope. So let me just give you an example. So let's say that you have one department X within the scope, and then you are actually protecting the information, the data within this department by applying all of these controls from Annex A. So A5 organizational controls, A6 people controls, A7 physical controls, A8 technological controls. And by the way, if you don't know which controls are included, you can open this big guide to ISO 27001 that we've sent you the link to, and you'll find all the controls there. Okay, now what do you do actually if you have some departments which are outside of the scope? This is displayed here on the left-hand side of the screen. In this case, you're treating these departments as a kind of, let's say, external entities, external from the point of view of the ISMS, because, I mean, they are part of your company, but they're external to your ISMS. In this case, you define some kind of policies and procedures or protocols through which you define how they have to behave and how they have to protect your information. So let's say that you included in your scope, I don't know, software development department, but your human resources department is outside of the scope. And through these company-wide policies and procedures and protocols, you actually have to define for your human resources department how they need to protect the data, which is important for your scope. Okay, so this is something that this is how you deal with departments of your own company that are outside of the scope. Now, when you have to deal with the suppliers, which are also handling your data, which is in your scope. So let's say that, again, you have a software development department in your scope, but also, I don't know, engineering department, but they're hosting this data on some cloud provider. Now, how do you actually handle security of this data when it's handled by a third party? This is done through these security clauses in agreements and terms and conditions. So you sign these legal documents, these agreements and contracts with your suppliers, and there you actually specify what exactly you expect from them when it comes to protection of data. Okay, so this is how you impose security rules, even though on entities that are outside of your scope, but when you want to protect the data, which is which you defined that is in the scope. My point here is that even though that the data is defined, that data which is defined as your scope, it always somehow goes out of the scope, and then you have to use these methods to protect this data when it is processed by entities that are not within your scope. Okay, so we'll share now a link to this article which explains how to handle supplier security in 27001. It will, help you understand a little bit more about, these suppliers. And let me show you now how to actually define the scope using this software called Conformio. So just give me a second to switch the screen. So for those of you who still don't use Conformio, the Conformio is basically a software that we developed in 𝗿𝗲𝗿𝗏, which helps you implement the whole standard, of course, including the definition of the scope. I'll show you very briefly how it works. So basically here you have the steps, so software takes you step by step through the whole implementation. And as you can see in the phase 1 project preparation, you also see the definition of the ISMS scope here, right? Then you have the second phase, risk management. Then you have security documentation. This is where you write most of your policies and procedures. And then you have this fourth phase where you prepare for the external audit. And then you finally go into this maintenance and certification phase. When speaking about writing the ISMS scope documents, all of the documents that are needed for ISO 27001 are already included in this software in Conformio. And concretely, the document for ISMS scope document looks like this. And it already has this wizard. And basically, this wizard takes you through step by step, and you actually have to insert specific information for your company. So users of this document are, then you define, let's say, employees in IT department, so something like this. Okay, and then you move on to the next question, and then it already suggests you, various things that you can fill out for processes and services, and whatever you write here, it's already automatically displayed in the document. And it goes very quickly. It's very easy to fill this out. Another feature I wanted to show you is this audit and evidence. So when you go for the preparation for the audit, you have these dashboards which show you, which documents you have written, which documents are still in progress, and so on and so forth. So basically, it gives you a very good gap analysis on what you have to perform, what is yet missing, and also for each clause, per clause, it shows you actually whether you're ready for the certification or not. So let's when I open this clause 4, you see 4.1 to 4.4, and it basically says that you are, I mean, this is of course a test account. It says it's here ready here. So let's see this 4.3. When I open the details, it explains what this clause is about, and it also explains how you implemented it and which documents are related to this particular clause. So you have everything, in one place. You can very easily, see where the gaps are and how far did you go in your implementation. We'll share now with you this link where you can sign up for a free trial. So you have this 14-day free trial, so you can test out all the features in Conformio, see how it works. You can also test this scope document if you want, you'll be able to see if this is something that could be useful for you. Okay, very well. Now let's move on to the next slide. What are typically the biggest challenges when setting the scope? And basically this slide is based on your inputs. So I've tried to kind of summarize the things that people are struggling with the most. One of the challenges is basically defining the scope for SaaS solutions. And I believe I've gone through this. I've shown you this separate slide where I define, how to define the scope for depending on the technical solution you're using. Another challenge was agreeing with the company what are the most critical parts to be included in the scope. And I would say, again, if you're smaller than 50 employees, go for your whole company. But if you're larger than 50 employees, then try to figure out where you have the most sensitive data. Okay. Most of the companies say, yes, this is the IT department. True, IT department does process most of these critical data, but it's not the only department which has sensitive data. Going back to this example of a pharmaceutical company, the most valuable thing that these guys have, pharmaceutical company has, is these formulas for these let's say drugs, the medications that they're developing, right? This development costs extreme amount of money, and they have to protect this information very, very carefully. So obviously R&D department would be one of the departments they want to protect. Okay, the approach, if we should define it by departments or by assets or by services, typically my recommendation is that you go by departments, is the easiest. You could also you should also define the scope by, in terms of processes, but you should start with departments. If you start with the departments and then define the processes within these departments, then it's easier. You should not do this by assets. No, it's not going to be good. And you should not be doing this by services. Again, it's not going to work well. If the whole organization should be in scope or only some entities, okay, so as I explained, this depends really primarily on the size of the company. Good, so let me then make some conclusions, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. So as you can see, if you define the scope correctly at the very beginning of your project, then you will not go too wide or too narrow with your ISO 27001 implementation, and you will save quite a lot of time if you do it right from the very beginning. And of course, for that purpose, you can use a tool like Conformio, and we'll also share now with you a link if you want to schedule a call with our Conformio expert, and he'll show you how the software works. So basically you can test it out yourself for a free trial, or you can ask our colleague to show you the details. So whichever way works with you the best, feel free to use it. Okay, right, now let's move on to the next slide. Let's start with this questions and answers session. And please do send your questions through the chat window, and I'll answer your questions. Let me just see if anything came in. Just give me a second. Okay, I see one question coming in. But before I start answering questions, just let me go through a couple of announcements here. So first, feel free to contact me directly through email. We'll share now with you my email address. So if you have any questions you want to ask directly, feel free to do it through email. You can also follow me on YouTube and LinkedIn. And on LinkedIn, I basically share the latest news from this cybersecurity world, from this compliance world. So if you want to stay up to date, you can follow me on LinkedIn. On YouTube, I publish lots of videos on ISO 27001, but also on DORA and NIS2. So if you want to, let's say, learn through this video format, please follow me on my YouTube channel. And I also have this Secure and Simple podcast that is intended for consultants. So if you're a consultant and you want to learn about best practices for consultants and how to be actually successful in building your consultancy practice, then you can see these, you can take a look at my Secure and Simple podcast. Okay, another thing is that my next webinar will be next Wednesday at the same time. And it will be about the UK Procurement Act and what kind of opportunities it presents for companies that are certified, ISO certified. And this will be presented by my colleague 𝗏𝗏𝗶𝘀𝗁. So basically you'll see lots of useful tips on how you can actually work in UK as an ISO certified company. So if you have any kind of connection to United Kingdom, then this webinar could be interesting for you. And we'll also share with you now the links to sign up to see all the upcoming webinars. All right, now let me see the questions that I received. Okay, there is a question from, actually let me go through a question that I received before the webinar. So it was from Simon. The question was, will the ISO 27001 implementer course and exam cover 27002 and 27005 information, as 27002 is cardinal to the implementation of ISO 27001? Okay, so it's like this. Yes, the advisor as a lead implementer course does cover the best practices from 27002 and 27005. And so, by the way, I will share now with you the link to this lead implementer course that you can take a look if you're interested in pursuing, let's say, this certification, personal certification. But I have to explain just one thing around these other standards. 27001 is a mandatory standard, right? If you want to get a certificate as a company, you must comply with all the requirements from 27001. 27002 is not a mandatory standard. 27005 is not a mandatory standard. What does this mean? Whatever is written in 27002, you do not have to implement it. Why? Because it's only a guidance. And everything that I say is also valid for 27005. So these two standards are guidances on how you might implement controls from, let's say, 27001. So there is this one control from 27001. It's called 8.13. It's around backup. And to be honest, 27001 doesn't tell you much about how you implement the backup. It only says that you have to implement the backup based on, let's say, your criticality of data, and that you have to test the backup periodically. 27002 shows the same control, but it puts around one page of text where it suggests you how you could do it, right? But it's not mandatory. You can implement it in a completely different way, which is not mentioned in 27002, and still comply with this very short requirement in 27001. So I'm just trying to explain you here that 27002 and 27005 are useful, but they are not crucial for implementing 27001. Okay, good. Now let me go back to a question I received from Salvador. Can you upload an existing document to Conformio? I'm thinking on companies that might have the process started but they get stuck halfway. Yes, of course. For each of these steps that I've shown you on Conformio in the Conformio interface, you can decide between using Conformio's documents, right? Our template, which is built into Conformio, or simply clicking another button where you want to upload your own document. So it's up to you really to decide which approach you take. So it's I would say very flexible in this regards. Okay, let me see if there are any other questions coming in. Okay, I don't see any other question. Good. If there are no other questions, then let me wrap up the webinar. So just a few words before I finish. As mentioned, this webinar today was intended really to give you an overview of key, I would say, issues and requirements regarding ISMS scope. It was really not designed to go into very details of, I don't know, risk assessment or NXA controls. And for that purpose, of course, you can see these resources that we've sent you the links to on Advisor website. You can also test Conformio software to see how it helps you with the implementation and with all of these things. And regarding the PDF presentation deck, we'll actually publish this link with the presentation deck in about 10 minutes. And if you joined this webinar through LinkedIn or through YouTube, then simply stay on this very page where you're watching the webinar now. So after the webinar ends, keep this tab open for about 10 minutes, and then you will see that in the comment section we will publish the link to download this PDF presentation deck. So simply stay on the page and you will see the link. With regards to people who joined through Zoom, we'll send you actually the link to this presentation deck through email, and we'll send this link by tomorrow morning, so you'll see this email with the link. Okay, finally also see our short survey, and I would kindly ask you to spend a minute to fill this out, just to get a feeling on how well I'm doing and on what I can improve. So if you can fill this out, I would be thankful. And this would be all. Thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you have enjoyed this webinar.